Hello and welcome to episode 327 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good. Football's coming home. Probably people have just turned over now I've said that. But I was listening to a past podcast of ours the other day, and I did chuckle because there was one where you were hopefully talking about Watford, I think, winning the FA Cup semi-final. It was 5 years ago, and I did chuckle because you'd even said in the podcast we'll be probably coming back to this in years to come, and just laughing at me for my optimism. And it was true.
Yeah, but when you say it was true that my optimism was unfounded. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we lost 1-0 or 2-1 to Crystal Palace. Anyway, no one wants to know that. The fact of the matter is Watford didn't win the game.
And it was the same time that Spurs were in the hunt for the league title. So that shows you it was almost like a parallel universe. So I'm very good, Andy. We're going to read out a review in a second before we kick on with the show, because I've got so much I need to cover this week. We don't want to hang around. But one thing I did want to mention before we move on, last week we talked about games for teaching children about money. And now I'm not going to add one to that list, but I was just going to say I played Monopoly over the weekend, and if you recall, I said I didn't like the game Monopoly from my childhood, but this is a new version called Monopoly Voice Banking. Now, it won't teach your kids anything about money, I can just put that out there, but it makes Monopoly actually fun. I played the game twice, that's how good it is. And effectively what it is, it's you get a big hat, so like the old piece of the Monopoly board, the character, you get a hat that is essentially an Alexa speaker, and the game works by you pressing a button and talking to this speaker when you're doing things around the board, and it keeps tabs of all the money, who owns what, who's got houses on different squares, and so you don't even have to keep money. You can't cheat because the hat is the banker, and so it just makes the game playing in about probably half an hour tops. And so it made Monopoly fun, but you won't learn anything because there is no money. You have to actually ask the hat who's winning, because it's quite difficult to tell at times, and how much money you've got in your electronic, obviously, bank account. But it was quite a good version of Monopoly. So I just throw it out there that I did play Monopoly at the weekend. I did enjoy it, but it's because it's been brought to the 21st century.
I love the fact that games are innovating. Obviously, a lot of games are moving over to mobile versions as well now, and you can play them online. But the fact that they're bringing board games with a bit of tech as well, I think that's great. Actually, I'll probably end up seeking that one out. I've actually bought a couple of board games in the last couple of weeks. Again, they're not money-related ones necessarily for children, but there was some special offers on over the last week, and I nabbed myself a couple of bargains. So I'll probably be playing board games this weekend in between all the football, so that'll be good fun.
And on board games, somebody did mention on our socials, because we put out the games that we liked, and if you go on our socials, people start to respond the games that they actually like to play. And somebody put the Game of Life on there, and I've been reliably informed that the Game of Life is very different to the Game of Life that we probably played as kids. But I actually have a version in my house that is the original version, so it must be based on that before they redid it, because that old version is terrible in terms of the lessons it's teaching people about rewarding people for, you make money for having kids and getting married, and it's all sort of, it's not nowhere near the 21st century standard of our political correctness and the way we view the world. But there is a new version which is much better for teaching children about life goals. So that's another one that was thrown out there by people listening. So I'm going to go on with what's on the podcast. This week I'm going to do 3 pieces. I'm going to talk about the steps to financial freedom and sorting out your finances, because we've mentioned it on the podcast before, talked about it in terms of what financial freedom is. I even gave a view of how people could achieve it. But there are some recipes for achieving financial freedom that are out there. And one of them was made famous by a chap called Dave Ramsey, who people who listen to the podcast might have heard of, who's in America. But I'm just going to talk about some of the steps so people can listen to it and see where they are on this journey and what they might need to do next. Because I'm going to elaborate and talk about a different version, not just what Dave Ramsey thinks about life. I'm also going to talk about black box thinking. This is something that I think everybody needs to do, and it's about embracing your money mistakes. And the final piece we're going to do is about apps that can help you overpay your mortgage.
Okay, so before we get on with the podcast this week, we did promise we'd read out some reviews. We'll keep it nice and short and sweet this week. We'll read out one, and it's from Super Samosa. Been listening to Damien and Co for a couple of years now and have completely changed the way I manage my money. Cheers. So that was from Super Samosa. We'll read out more next week, so long as you keep reviewing the podcast and sending them in. It really helps us fly up those charts. Every podcast does it, I know, but honestly, we read every single one of them and we love getting them. Okay, so on with the podcast then. Steps to financial freedom. What have we got?
So if you go back to podcast 144, I did talk about how to achieve financial freedom and financial independence. And it was my view on ways you could do it, but it was much more hypothetical in terms of rather than steps, but things you should try and aim towards in terms of generating income, etc., that can replace what you receive via your day job or your business. And the idea of trying to build a cash machine. So you can go back and listen to that. But today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to run through something that's high level, but is a bit like a recipe. So people can see where they are on these steps through life to be able to achieve financial freedom. And then these steps, you have to realize you can move backwards and forwards in this journey. So you need to find out where you are. If you're at step one, great, complete step one, then you move on to step two, etc., etc. But you do move backwards and forwards because things happen in life and sometimes there are setbacks. So if I start with step one is what most people would say is build a budget. Okay, so if you've not done that, you've not done step one. So everybody needs to try and do step one first of all. But rather than think of it as a budget, as I've said in past episodes, probably a long time ago, so most people won't have heard it, is don't think of it as a budget, think of it as a spending plan. So how are you going to spend your money? Where is it going to go? How is it going to be divided? What are you going to spend your money on? How much discretionary spending have you got? There are a range of apps out there that can help you. Money Dashboard is one of my favorites, I have to say. I know there's Emma app is another one. Once you've built your plan, then you've obviously got to look at your benefits you might be able to receive. So go to entitled to, you'll Google that, you'll find the website, and you can find out very quickly via a tool. It will tell you the different benefits you may be entitled to, and that includes things like child benefit, for example, that you might be able to claim. So don't just think it's for people who haven't got any money. Everybody should do this. Now, I will say at this point, of course, you can go and do the MOT. So our money MOT, if you go onto our website, moneytothemasses.com, you'll see a big picture of me and a big yellow piece off the front page where you can click through and do a money MOT. It's about 12 questions, take you 2 minutes, and it will give you an action plan if you want it and how you can improve your finances in a much more bespoke way that's suited to you based on what you've input into the tool, the answers that you've given. But this piece on the podcast is giving you a nice general steer of how you should be thinking about your money. So you then make sure you pay your essential bills. You obviously pay at least the minimum on any debt that you've got. So any unsecured debt, things like credit cards, and you want to insure things that you can't afford to lose. So we did a piece on insurance a couple of podcast episodes ago, the risk versus reward. Go back and listen to that. And of course, you need to make sure you then can pay your non-essential bills, some of those that might be discretionary. So you've got a budget if you've done all of that. That's what people need to do. If you've not done that, then go and look on the past episodes that we've done on the podcast, or if you go onto the Money to the Masses website and put in the word budgeting, and we will link to some articles in the show notes. That's your job for this weekend. Once you've done that, you'll get on to step two. And step two is to remove your reliance on credit. So if you are reliant on credit, so you're always having to use it to be able to survive, and you're finding yourself not being able to clear that, then you need to speak to somebody like stepchange.org.uk. You need to get help. If you aren't reliant on credit, so you are able to start paying off your debts, then make sure you build a repayment plan where you start to use the snowball effect, where you start paying down either the highest debt first, with the most interest, and you put all your money towards that. So you pay the minimums on all your debt, put as much money as you can that you've got left over that isn't going on your bills and the other things that I've spoken about, put that on the highest debt. Then you start to clear that debt. And then when you cleared that one, and you move that money down onto the next debt. Again, we'll link to an article in the show notes. But of course, you can do it another way where you end up clearing the smallest debt first, because then you get that kind of momentum, that psychological boost by getting rid of a debt. So you get rid of a credit card that you're still paying off. So assuming you've done that step, then you you move on to step 3. So you congratulate yourself, you've moved on to the next phase. Now you want to start to build a small emergency fund. And that normally is about 1 to 3 months of outgoings. Personally, I would go for at least 6 months. There is a school of thought that you could go up to 12 months. If you go to podcast 270, we talk about emergency funds and how you can build them. On podcast 281, we talk about how you access emergency funds. So when you need to, what's the best way to do that? So that will give you a nice buffer against the things that could go wrong in life. Then you go on to step 4, which you then start looking at things like you want to auto enroll at work. You want to make sure you're getting that free money from your employer. Step 5, you want to then start clearing any high interest debt that you have. So you really are working at clearing any extra debt that you've got, because step 2, it really is about removing that reliance on debt. But you want to now try and get rid of it. You can argue that some people start to do that before they built up their emergency buffer to like 6 months worth of pay. So you could argue there's like a step 6 where you could extend your cash buffer once you've cleared all of your debt down. And I'll come on to that. Dave Ramsey's a bit of a fan of actually building up a small buffer and then tackling your debt, not building up a full 12-month buffer before you tackle debt, which is kind of the conventional wisdoms. We talk about that in podcast 315, where I talk about breaking golden rules. You then get onto step 7. So if you're at this point, you're doing pretty well because you've got most of your finances in order. You've got your debt under control and you've got a nice buffer to be able to protect you from the unexpected. Just think of what happened in 2020 when we had COVID come along and the pandemic, how many people were impacted financially. Step 7, you're getting to the point where you can then save and invest for your shorter term goals, so things that are less than 5 years. This again is largely going to be you putting money aside into savings, because if it's less than 5 years time frame, then you don't really want to invest because you're probably going to need to access the money, and the money won't have time to recover if you put it in the stock market and the stock market crashes. So you're looking at things more than likely savings accounts, using your savings allowance. Then you might want to use cash ISAs as well. And then finally you get onto step 8. You're then looking at investing for your longer term goals. Now, if your longer term goals, they are more than 5 years away in the future, then you can start taking investment risk. That can mean investing in things like stocks and shares and bonds. But if your long term goal is beyond the age of, let's say, 55, because our pension age is going up, so 55 at the moment is the first point you can access a pension. If it's beyond those ages, 55 to 58, then a school of thought is you should therefore be piling into your pension and making sure you claim all that tax relief that you're entitled to, especially if you're a 40% taxpayer, because you're getting that basically Brucey bonus on the way in. It's all rolling up and growing free of tax, and then you'll be on your way to financial freedom. And of course, if you have goals that are occurring before you're able to access your pension, then don't forget you can use your stocks and shares ISA allowance. There is a case for some people using a lifetime ISA if they're trying to buy a house, for example. And these things can invest in the same assets as a pension. So they're just tax wrappers. You can invest in the same assets within them. So that gives you a broad framework. It's not perfect. People could pick holes. I haven't gone into complete detail on all of it, but work out where you are on that timeline. Do you need to go to the next step? What do you need to do next? Now, it just takes me on before I finish up this piece, because I like the idea of giving people listening to this podcast, that's where I am, and this is what I probably want to think about next, and they can then research around it. Dave Ramsey has something called his baby steps. Now, Dave Ramsey is a guy who has a radio show in the US. I find him quite abrasive in some ways. Lots of people like him. He's very popular, but for a UK audience, they can find him maybe a little bit, I don't know quite what the word is, but it's
in
a
your
little
face.
It is a bit in your face. I don't want to make it sound like I don't like him or anything, but it's just it's a particular it's that style where you're made to feel slightly inferior, I think sometimes, but it's very good. He gives you a good wake up call. That's what he does. His 7 baby steps, and he turns this into a process. Step 1 is put $1,000 in an emergency fund. We touched upon this in podcast 315. Go and listen to that. I explain more about that. His view is you need to break that cycle of being reliant on credit, which is, I mentioned that in the previous steps that I talked about earlier. So breaking that cycle. So you might still have that debt, but you need to not live in debt. That can provide that cash buffer. So it's a different way of doing it rather than clearing your debt before you build a buffer. Step 2 is then paying off your debt. Step 3 is fully funding an emergency fund. So you can see there's parallels to what I was talking about earlier, to giving yourself a proper 12-month emergency fund. Step 4, maximize your retirement. He thinks contribute around about about 15% of your earnings into your pension. Step 5, he talks about funding college for kids. That's a bit of an American thing. Most people don't fund their children going to college or anything in this country. Yes, you might want to fund money for them going to university. If you do, then you need to start thinking about that. Step 6, this is what's quite interesting about Dave Ramsey. He's a big one on paying off your mortgage. He thinks that's the next thing you have to do, is really go to town on paying off your mortgage, because then you own that asset and that's how you can increase wealth. I do agree with him on that part, that if you own your property, of course, then you will be financially free, because you won't owe money to anybody and you own your house and they can't kick you out. And then step 7, which is his final one, which is continue to build wealth and then give back to other people. So you end up doing charitable things with that money. So along that way, if you think about maximizing retirement, funding for your children's college and all that, they're investing along the way. So you can see those are the steps. We'll put links in the show notes. You can find an infographic, for example, that will have these steps in there. You can find out more. For some people, it works really well, but that gives you an overview of almost a recipe of what you should be doing, what you should be thinking about next, and where are you on that. First thing you've all got to do is therefore do a budget, a spending plan, and then remove your reliance on debt. As soon as you do those, then things become a bit more exciting. You can then start thinking about investing. The problem is we often want to run before we can walk, and that's the problem with finances. You need to try and do things in the right order to increase your chances of success.
Okay, so moving on to the next piece of the podcast then, black box thinking, embracing your mistakes. What's this about?
Right, so I've been reading, I read a lot of books, and one of them that I've been reading is one called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed. And the book is about, it sort of focuses on the concept about your successes come from owning up to your mistakes and actually owning them and learning from them. That lies at the heart of the book. So the black box thinking, as you know, when planes crash, they go looking for the black box. It's the thing that tells them about the information so they can learn about what happened and prevent it happening in the future. Ironically, they're not actually black anymore. I think they're much brighter, luminous colours to make them far easier to find if they end up in water, for example. But the book, I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes again, so people might want to read it. And of course, you can listen to it. It's on Audible as well. But he gives a fantastic example of more people die from mistakes made by doctors in hospitals than they do from traffic accidents. Now, why is that? And the reason it occurs is because if a doctor makes a mistake, and let's say somebody dies on the operating table, then the natural response of most people and the profession and most industries that we know, and I can tell you for certain it happens in a lot of industries, particularly education, I'm not going to go into that, it's a personal story, but they start to cover up and they start to try and lay the blame with other people or the circumstances. And so they don't learn from their mistakes. So somebody who is a doctor, somebody dies on the operating table, rather than say that was me, or there'd be a big investigation into what happened, the only time it tends to happen if there's an investigation is somebody tries to sue them. Well, that happens in a lot of industries where you only uncover the truth of a scenario and therefore can prevent it happening again is when somebody starts to sue. Now, the one industry where that isn't true is the aviation industry. The aviation industry has a black box, and the aim of that black box is to record all that information so they can analyze what went wrong so they can make changes and so it can't happen again. It's the outlier of life in society where there's a collective desire to learn from the mistakes that are made. It's not about putting blame on an individual person or thing, although that can inevitably be part of what happens when they do these investigations, but that isn't the fundamental purpose. Now, if you go through any other walk of life, you will tend to see that people don't do that. The natural response for all of us as humans, and it's ingrained in us because of society, if there's something happens, is you blame someone else. You don't acknowledge that it's your fault. And so with the aviation industry, the onus is to learn, and then everybody learns. We can't have the same mistake. We've all watched the programs. They're fascinating when airplanes crash. I don't know why we end up watching them. I've lost many a late night when it comes on and you start watching a plane and why it crashed, and you get so sucked into those programs, and then you scare yourself off of flying again in the future. I mean, I don't know why we end up watching them. But we need to apply the black box thinking to the rest of our lives, because success only happens, according to Matthew Syed, and he's totally correct on this, when we confront our mistakes. And the aviation's brilliant safety record is because they acknowledge those mistakes and learn from them. So from this part of the podcast, people need to apply this to their own finances. You can take black box thinking and you apply it to your own relationship with money. So it means that you need to firstly get a progressive attitude to failure. And that means that you don't see failure as something negative, you see it as an opportunity to learn, something to learn from. And you also need to make sure you don't reframe what happens or the evidence of any failings rather than challenge your own beliefs. So by that I mean that if something doesn't happen in accordance to how you believe it would do, then you blame something else. So let's say, for example, you decided to go and invest in a particular investment. Maybe it was you were going to go and build a buy-to-let empire and it failed. Then don't reframe the evidence of what occurred or why it failed, so that your idea that maybe building a buy-to-let empire was the best thing you could ever do, rather than acknowledging that you'd personally made some mistakes along the way in terms of how you'd run your business or something like that. Whatever it is, don't reframe it to blame somebody else. You need to look at it objectively. And one of the ways you do that is everything you do in finance, you need to see it as a kind of a hypothesis that you're trying to test. That takes the emotion out of it. And one of the things that you could try and think about your finances is to think of it like a guided missile. And I think it's a great analogy. When they fire a missile and trying to hit their target, the target thereafter is moving. They don't necessarily know where the target's going to be. So if a guided missile, heat-seeking missile, whatever you want to call it, gets fired and it's tracking its target to destroy it. Success is only achieved if that is able to make minute adjustments all the way and learn from what's going on ahead of it and then be able to hit its target. Your finances are exactly the same. So what I'm saying is that if you go back to the first part of this podcast, I talked about some plans that were there that you could follow. That's how you launch the missile and how you're going to likely hit your target. But all of these things have to be adjusted as you go along. There's no perfect recipe. So you need to firstly own any failings. So for example, take me in my life when I was younger, my failings were clearing debt. So when I was young, I first left university and I had a job, and the job at the time paid me quite well. And I racked up lots of debt. I ended up getting sucked into by one of these credit card companies where they have people standing there saying, sign up to a credit card while you're walking around a shopping centre. I was young, I was naive, and I just signed up, went on a shopping spree. But at the same time, I was just like many people hooked on consumerism really and buying things that I didn't really need to impress people I didn't really like, that kind of thing. And what happened is as I was earning money, I could have cleared that debt each month. I never did. And in the end, I got into loads of debt. I really quite a sizable debt that I then struggled to clear when I eventually then changed jobs and my finances weren't in as good a state as they, in terms of income, as they were when I started accruing that debt. I learned the lesson the hard way. I didn't blame anyone else. I took it on board that basically I'd gone and borrowed from tomorrow to live today. And that was a mistake. And I had to sit there and pay it back. And I learned, and if anyone knows me now, I'm not into consumerism. I don't really buy lots of nice things or clothes. I've gone the other way. So I learned from my mistake, which is why I got better with money. So you own your mistakes as you go along. What is interesting is as a parent, or if you're trying to teach your children or school children, your teacher trying to teach them about something, that idea of owning your mistakes is quite key because then they can learn from yours. So think about that aviation industry. You can learn from other people's mistakes, but you can only learn from them if they own up to them and you look at them and they're analysed. But that's the problem. We all like to paint a very wonderful picture about our money, that how we got to where we are. Some of it is luck, some of it is bad choices. You've got to admit when you've made bad choices. And for me, when we talked about the debt, I initially reframed the evidence that I was spiraling and not able to control my debt by using the idea that maybe I had less than the average person did. But the truth be told, I probably wasn't managing my money half as good as the average person. So by reframing the evidence of saying that, yeah, that debt isn't that bad, it's down to my circumstances because I wanted to get this or that. Actually, my belief that I could live a lifestyle that I was fundamentally flawed. And so I had to challenge that I couldn't afford to do these things. And that was something that's quite powerful for me in the end. And I was able to then say to people that I wasn't going to be able to do certain things. The other thing is, like, if you take that guided missile approach, I do think that it also helps people realize that success is embedded in lots of incremental wins. So you eventually get there. So take investing. So we talk about apps and things that can help you start to invest small amounts, maybe building a cash buffer. When we talked about, if people go back and listen to the episodes I mentioned earlier about ways to build cash buffers and apps that you can use, that's along those lines. You're trying to build a cash buffer. You can do small wins by using those apps that help you maybe round up the change and build a buffer. You'll eventually get to where you want to go, but it's like the guided missile concept. So embrace your failings, speak about them, acknowledge them, and try to learn from them. And if we all did that, then collectively we would be much better with money. I think that's one of the biggest things that financial education loses, is that we talk about things in a way that makes people feel bad, and we make people feel like you don't want to own up to your mistakes because you feel like a loser. And a lot of the experts that I see on telly, and they sit there and berate people about how rubbish they are with their money. Yeah, there is an element of you've got to own up to your mistake. You're trying to shock them into it. But we should start talking about our own as well, because I think people don't do that enough, rather than just point out other people's flaws. Because one of the things that Matthew Syed mentioned in his book, and it's very true, if you're very good at pointing out other people's flaws and what they do badly, it actually encourages you to be less honest about your own ones, because you don't want to be perceived in the same light as those people.
Okay, so moving on to the final piece in the pod then, and we're going to be talking about apps that can help you overpay your mortgage. Damien, what have we got?
So if you go back to episode 320 of the podcast, we did a piece with Laura about overpaying your mortgage. So I'm not going to go over the reasons to how much you can save. You can save a hell of a lot of money. On average, most people, if they pay £100 extra a month, they can knock off about 5 years from their mortgage. So there's lots of details we covered in that podcast about the pros and cons of whether you should and shouldn't, and what to look out for, such as the early repayment charges. So assuming you've listened to podcast 320 and you like the idea of overpaying your mortgage, but you just haven't had the funds to do it, and you kind of want to start, there are ways in which you can start to chip away at being able to overpay your mortgage. So if you take the Dave Ramsey example, he talks about clearing his mortgage. If you got to that stage, then you may want to see if you can start to chip away and make some inroads. Because after all, a lot of people think you have to commit quite hefty amounts to chipping away at your mortgage to actually make a difference. But you can do it small amounts. It starts to get you, like the guided missile idea, you're starting to make small victories along the way. So there are some apps that can help you. Now, there was one in particular which sparked this piece on the podcast that has been launched, where the sole aim is to help you overpay your mortgage when you shop. Andy looked into this into a bit of detail this week, so I'm going to hand over to Andy on this bit.
Okay, so there's a relatively new app available, and it's called Accelerate My Mortgage, and it's an interesting concept. Essentially what it is, it's an app you can download and you can link it up to your spending via a third-party connection. And what it does is it will look for the retailers that you're spending at and see if there's any cashback offers available. Now, there's around about 100 retailers that are linked to this app. And if you were to purchase anything through those partner retailers within the app, you could earn anything up to 5, 6, 7, 8% cashback with those retailers. Now, the cashback varies depending on which retailer it is. Some, it might be 0.5%, 1%, and obviously there are many retailers that aren't supported. But the idea is that you don't have to go out of your way to try and earn this cashback. The cashback is automatically applied via this app and it will start to accrue. So say, for example, you want to do some gardening at the weekend, and so you spent a couple of £100 at B&Q. B&Q are available via Accelerate My Mortgage as a cashback offer, and it's 2%. So in that scenario, you'd earn yourself £4 cashback. And as soon as you have accrued £50 or more via the Accelerate My Mortgage cashback app, then you'll be able to pay that amount of money off of your mortgage. Now, Accelerate My Mortgage will get in touch with you. When you sign up, they'll ask who your mortgage provider is, and they'll take a bit more information. And as soon as you hit that £50 amount, it kind of opens up a new window within the app itself, and they'll find out a bit more information about the specific mortgage. They'll ask a few more details, and essentially they will set up for you the overpayment. Now, there's a few restrictions with some lenders. Some lenders, you have to pay a specific amount off, say at least £250 increments. They'll take care of all that for you. And actually, if they can't do it automatically for you, then they'll quite happily send you the money into your bank account. And then it's up to you to then facilitate that overpayment. Essentially, it's an app that will help you to easily build a cash amount of money that can then be effectively automatically paid off your mortgage. I think it's an interesting concept. It's not going to pay hundreds and hundreds immediately, but over time, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I have to say, so it's basically, like you said, a cashback app that links directly to a mortgage. But it's this idea that if you chip away and start doing something, I know personally from experience that when I started to try then save money and invest, once you start doing that, even small amounts, it becomes addictive, because the idea, for example, paying yourself first, and like I've done in the past, where a bill, you might pay a certain amount of money each month into a savings account, even if it's like £5, £10, or you use an app that helps you, it becomes addictive and you start seeing that grow, I'm going to do more. So I like the idea because it would get people on the idea of overpaying their mortgage, something that people could think about if they're further on in the journey, as I mentioned earlier on, when it's appropriate to do so. I mean, you have to be slightly cynical. Yes, that company also does mortgage reviews, so they will be getting in touch with you trying to review your mortgage more than likely if you give them permission to. But I like the idea. What I'm going to do now, though, is quickly rattle through some alternative options, because, as Andy said, it's a cashback app that enables you to pay off your mortgage automatically. But there are others out that you can use. So, for example, Moneybox. I am a fan of Moneybox if you use it for savings. So you can use Moneybox to link up to your bank accounts and credit cards. And what it will do is it will look at your spending, and it will then round up the amount you've spent to the nearest pound, and then take that from your account in weekly direct debits and put it into a savings account if you choose. And they are protected under the FSCS. So that is a real positive. And it means over time you can start to accrue money by basically just spending and living your life. You can do double roundup. So if that means if you spent £2.60 in the supermarket, then it would actually round up, rather than just 40p, it would round up 80p. And then it does that for a week, takes all those roundups, and then, like I say, once a week, takes a direct debit. It has been effective. I mean, I say I like the savings element because they do have investments. So you could put it into a stocks and shares ISA, for example, sweep that money across each week. But their charges are a little bit on the expensive side because they do have a monthly fee if you're only putting small amounts in. But I've used it for a savings account, for example, and in about 9 months, I managed to save about £300 by just rounding up loose change. So I do think it is a positive. You take that, you could pay that off your mortgage if you wanted. Other apps that do similar things, Plum also does. So Plum's another app that does a bit of budgeting as well, that can help you manage your money, but can also help you start to move money across into savings. It's similar to Moneybox in a lot of ways, but with the added budgeting element to it. Lloyd's bank account do the Save the Change scheme, which is exactly the same as what I've described, but it only works within Lloyd's. So if you have a Lloyd's account, you have the Save the Change scheme linked to it. Then if you spend on your Lloyd's account, then it will round the change up and put it into a savings account, which you could then use to overpay on your mortgage. Monzo and Starling Bank, they're modern banks, the app-only banks that allow you to squirrel money away into sections of the app, basically like portions of an account. And you can do that automatically with Roundup. So again, you can do that to save for anything you wanted, holidays or whatever, but you could use it to try and save up money to then pay off small amounts off your mortgage. And of course, you could use something like Top Cashback if you like the cashback idea, and save up cashback via their app and then use that in time to be able to overpay your mortgage. Or you could just use a budgeting app, things like Money Dashboard or Emma, to be able to budget better, build a spending plan, so you have money left over at the end of the month, then sweep that across manually and pay it off your mortgage. So there are a lot of options out there, and for some people, it might be an attractive option.
Okay, so that's it for this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with a number 2. Don't forget, we've got the Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/moneytothemasses. We're having lots and lots of members join the group on a daily basis. Make sure you do if you haven't already, because you can speak to like-minded people, maybe ask questions about the pod, even put ideas forward for future pods. And lastly, of course, we mentioned at the start of the podcast, if you could review the podcast, it will be great. It really helps us out. Damien, I think that's it. We're done for this week.
Yeah, we're done. So until next time.
Until next time.